Good evening, everyone, and welcome to our fall lecture. My name is Carolyn Grice, and I'm the Vice President of the Chevy Chase Historical Society. On behalf of our entire board, I would like to thank you for your support and your membership, and for your engagement with our programs. This evening's lecture, An Iconic House is Reborn, the History of 9 Chevy Chase Circle, will be a treat for anyone interested in preservation and local history. This architectural centerpiece of historic Chevy Chase, once home to Chevy Chase founder Francis Newlands, and also to entrepreneur William Corby, has been meticulously restored by current owner Adrian Arsht after years of neglect. 9 Chevy Chase Circle received a Montgomery Preservation Inc. Historic Preservation Award in 2021. I have the great pleasure of introducing our speakers, Emily Hotelling-Eig, founder and CEO of EHT Traceries, and John Gentry, Senior Architectural Historian and Project Manager for the firm. EHT Traceries is woman-owned and nationally recognized for its expertise in historic preservation for both public and private projects. Please join me in welcoming both Emily Hotelling-Eig and John Gentry.
Good evening. We had the pleasure of looking intensely into the William Corby mansion. It's been called Ishmaping by the Corbys, and now it is called The Folly by its current owner. It stands, as Carolyn said, the architectural centerpiece of the historic Chevy Chase community. Begun in 1890s, Chevy Chase was an upper middle class enclave, removed from the urban core of Washington in the salubrious natural setting of the Maryland countryside. The exclusive development represented the vision and determination of Nevada Senator Francis G. Newlands, who, through the investor-backed Chevy Chase Land Company and its subsidiaries, purchased the land, assembled a team of experts, and developed what would become the capital's premier late 19th century upper class suburban community. Completed in 1893, the house at 9 Chevy Chase Circle was originally built as a smaller dwelling for Nevada Senator William Stewart. Its first occupant, however, was Francis Newlands, who lived there with his second wife and their family until 1909, when the land company sold the property to Mr. Corby and his family. Corby was an innovative entrepreneur who transferred the commercial bread-making industry in the United States during the early 20th century. Upon acquiring the property, Corby retained noteworthy Washington architect Arthur B. Heaton, who transformed the original 1893 house into a Tudor Revival style mansion. The principal interior spaces reflect various historical influences, which range from Italian Renaissance to Adamesque. Heaton developed this design over a 5-year period between 1909 and 1914, when work was completed on the house. But then he continued between 1914 and 1921 to prepare additional designs for the grounds, including the rear garden, pool, and Connecticut Avenue entrance. He designed the garage for the Corbys in 1924 and continued to design minor alterations to the house into the 1930s. Corby and his family named their new home Ishpeming, which is typical for high ground. The Corbys were collectors of antiques and art, and their impressive, well-appointed home was the setting for many social and civic events. William Corby died in 1935, and his wife continued to reside at Ishpeming until her death in 1967. And now I'm going to turn the presentation over to John, who will give you a blow-by-blow of the history of this wonderful property. John?
Thank you, Emily. We will begin our presentation tonight by briefly examining the history of the creation of Chevy Chase during the early 1890s. We will next look at the design and construction of the original house in 1893. The purchase of the property by William S. Corby in 1909 was a key event in the history of the house, and we will discuss the Corbys and the complete transformation of the residence under the direction of architect Arthur Heaton. Not only did Heaton substantially redesign the house, but he also created a new landscape design for the property, which we will learn about as well. Finally, we will briefly look at the later period of Corby family ownership, post-Corby owners, and the restoration of the house in 2021. As many of you probably know, Chevy Chase is an emblematic example of the planned communities being established in the United States during the late 19th century. Beginning in the 1850s and 60s, the extension of horse-drawn streetcars and commuter railroads made the suburban lifestyle possible for the upper middle class. A natural setting for domestic life, separate from work, was an idea promoted by planners and theorists of the period, such as Andrew Jackson Downing, Frederick Law Olmsted, and Ebenezer Howard. In America, the development of suburban communities was influenced by English precedents, particularly the suburbs of London, which developed along coach roads leading into the city as weekend retreats for the city's wealthy merchants. In the United States, the expansion of streetcars outward from urban centers enabled a similar suburban expansion. Early examples of planned suburban communities included Llewellyn Park, New Jersey, 1857, Riverside, Illinois, 1869, and Pictured It Right, Chestnut Hill near Philadelphia in 1870, and New York's Tuxedo and Lawrence Parks in 1886 and 1889, respectively. These developments influenced later suburban projects across the country. Chevy Chase, the most comprehensive late 19th century suburban development in the Washington area, represents the confluence of architecture, landscape, infrastructure, and transportation. An accomplished San Francisco lawyer and U.S. Senator from Nevada, Francis G. Newlands was the visionary behind the creation of Chevy Chase. His father-in-law, Senator William Sharon, had made his fortune mining the Comstock lode during the Western Gold Rush. In 1874, Newlands married William Sharon's daughter, Clara. Senator Sharon embraced his new son-in-law, and soon Newlands was representing Sharon's extensive land holdings, which included the Palace Hotel in San Francisco, as well as property in the nascent DuPont Circle area of Washington, D.C. Sharon formed part of a group of land speculators in Washington that were informally known as the California Syndicate. In addition to Sharon, the group included San Francisco attorney Curtis Hillier, Nevada Senator William M. Stewart. Upon William Sharon's death in 1885, Newlands became one of the 2 trustees of the large estate, and funds from the sale of some of Sharon's Washington property would provide the initial capital for the development of Chevy Chase. Newlands confidently believed that the nation's capital was primed for future growth, and he realized the potential of suburban development in the area northwest of the city, along a projected extension of Connecticut Avenue. Between 1887 and 1890, Newlands orchestrated the purchase of 1,713 acres of the rural landscape that extended from the present-day Woodley Park area in the District of Columbia to Jones Bridge Road, which today marks the northern extent of Chevy Chase. Newlands' plan was to extend Connecticut Avenue to the northwest in order to link his new planned community with the city of Washington via a streetcar line. In June of 1890, Newlands went public with the formation of the Chevy Chase Land Company, incorporated in Montgomery County, Maryland. Francis Newlands served as president of the company, Edward Stellwagen as vice president, Albert Sucia as treasurer, and John H. Balloon as secretary. In 1893, Herbert Claude, an engineer hired to design the streetcar path, and noted Washington architect Leon Desaix became board members. Between 1891 and 1893, Newlands retained some of the country's top planners and architects to help him design and build Section 2, the first in a series of subdivisions that would constitute Chevy Chase. The group of experts assembled by Newlands included Samuel M. Gray of Providence, Rhode Island, a well-known sanitary engineer tasked with planning and designing the sewer and water system for the development. New York landscape engineer Nathan F. Barrett and civil engineer E.C. Reynolds were charged with street layout and landscape design. Respected Philadelphia architect Lindley Johnson designed the model cottages for the subdivision. Leon Desaix, a Washington architect known for his knowledge and experience in construction technology, collaborated with Johnson, individually designed a number of houses in Chevy Chase, and oversaw the construction of the cottages. Opened in 1893, Section 2 extended from Chevy Chase Circle and Grafton Street at the district line to Bradley Boulevard in Maryland. In its layout and landscape design, Section 2 reflected several aesthetic trends of the era. Its plan combined the formality and axial orientation of the City Beautiful movement with the naturalistic landscaping of the picturesque movement. Leon Desaix was born in 1858 in Washington, D.C. He began his career working as a draftsman for the firm of Hornblower and Poindexter, later Hornblower and Marshall. He later served in the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, assisting Colonel Lincoln Casey with the construction of the Washington Monument, and as an architectural and engineering draftsman at the Navy Yard. In 1886, he opened his own practice with an office in the Corcoran Building. Desaix was a founding member of the Washington chapter of the American Institute of Architects, a measure of his quick rise to local prominence in the architectural profession. He would later serve as the chapter's vice president and helped oversee the restoration of the Octagon House, the organization's headquarters. Throughout the late 1880s, Desai designed a number of prominent residences for the well-to-do clients in the greater Washington area. In 1893, Senator Newlands appointed Desai as chief architect of the Chevy Chase Land Company, a position Desai would retain for the next 25 years. Some of the best examples of Desai's work in Chevy Chase include the colonial revival style Bernie House at 9 East Kirk Street and the neoclassical Temple Front residence at 3 East Lenox Street. Born in Germantown, Pennsylvania in 1854, Lindley Johnson was one of the founders of Philadelphia's T-Square Club. Johnson enrolled in the nascent architectural program at the University of Pennsylvania in 1873. He studied in Paris for 3 years and spent 1 year working as a draftsman in Philadelphia before launching his own firm. A classically trained Beaux-Arts architect, Johnson was known for his lavish country houses and resorts. Nathan Barrett of New York pictured it right. The land company's landscape architect had previously been associated with Johnson in designing the early resort communities of Winter Harbor, Maine, Tuxedo Park, New York, and Ponce de Leon, Florida. Johnson was also associated with the development of Philadelphia's Fairmount Park, where he designed a number of structures, including a music pavilion, guardhouse, and even drinking fountains. As an École graduate, Johnson was active in the Beaux-Arts Society based in New York City and was a member of the Philadelphia chapter of the AIA. Pictured here are examples of Johnson's residential work, including cottages that he designed for the planned resort community of Grindstone Neck in Winter Harbor, Maine, between 1890 and 1893. The present house at 9 Chevy Chase Circle was originally designed and constructed as a smaller shingle-style dwelling. It was initially built for Nevada Senator William M. Stewart, an early land company investor, and it was completed in 1893. Senator Stewart, who reportedly picked out the site for the house, opted to reside elsewhere, and the house was first occupied by Francis Newlands and his family. Here, we see a photograph of the house taken in 1904, looking northeast from Chevy Chase Circle. This is an undated drawing of the south elevation of the original house, held at the Library of Congress. Between 1897 and 1902, Newlands leased the house during the summers to Lyman J. Gage, who served as Secretary of the Treasury under Presidents William McKinley and Theodore Roosevelt. In reporting on Gage's decision to lease the house, the Washington Evening Star newspaper described it as, quote, an ideal country seat, overlooking, quote, the rolling meadows that cut their outlines against the distant blue and silver of the Virginia hills and the waters of the Potomac. Pictured here is Secretary Gage, Assistant Secretary Vanderlip, Mrs. Gage, and Mrs. Gage's sister, seated on the south veranda. William S. Corby purchased the property from the Chevy Chase Land Company in 1909 and, upon completion of the extensive remodeling, lived in the house with his family until his death in 1935. Afterwards, his wife retained ownership of the house and resided there until her death in 1967. William Corby was an important figure in Washington as a manufacturer, inventor, and financier. In 1890, he established a small bakery at 520 12th Street Northwest in partnership with his brother, Charles I. Corby. The Corby brothers transformed bread production into an exact science. 8 U.S. patents were issued to the Corbys, the first in December of 1897, as well as foreign patents for the design of specialized dough molding machines used to work and shape dough into bread loaf forms. The machines were the first of their kind in the United States, and prior to the invention, loaves were molded by hand. In 1900, the brothers established the Ward Corby Baking Company, which applied their advances to large-scale production. The business expanded rapidly, shipping compressed yeast products across the country, as well as in Canada and Latin America. By the time that the Corby Baking Company was sold to the Continental Baking Corporation in 1925, it was operating 6 plants in Washington, Alexandria, and Richmond, and employed 700 workers. In 1909, Corby hired locally prominent architect Arthur B. Heaton to begin designing extensive alterations to the house. Born in Washington in 1875, Heaton attended DC public schools and apprenticed with the firm of Marsh and Peter and with Paul Pells, the architect of the Library of Congress building. Heaton established an architectural practice in Washington in 1898. He gained a reputation practicing in the newly developing areas of the city, including the neighborhoods along Connecticut Avenue. Heaton designed scores of houses, commercial buildings, and apartment buildings throughout his prodigious career. Heaton's principal works in the District of Columbia include the Equitable Building Association, 1911, the George Washington University's Corcoran and Stoughton Halls, designed with Albert Harris in 1924, the Methodist Home for the Aged, 1924, the National Geographic Building Administrative Wing in 1930, and Hearst Elementary School in 1932. Heaton was also responsible for 28 apartment buildings, including the Colonial Apartments, built in 1906, and the Altamont Apartments, built in 1915 and pictured here. In 1908, he was appointed supervising architect of the Washington Cathedral, and he served in this role for 14 years. Arthur Heaton died in 1951 at the age of 76. Arthur Heaton's intervention to the main residence included the complete remodeling of the exterior in the Tudor Revival style, the addition of a large mahogany paneled library on the ground floor, and the incorporation of a unique Tyrolean breakfast room. One of the most outstanding features of the Heaton renovation is the music room, which features a 30-foot high ceiling with painted wooden joists, paneled oak wainscoting, and an unusual Aeolian pipe organ at its north end. In addition to these changes to the main residence, Heaton also developed a landscape plan for the property that included a pool with flagstone walks and plantings. Heaton designed the current garage on the property between 1924 and 1926. Over a 5-year period, between 1909 and 1914, Heaton gradually developed the interior and exterior design scheme for the Corby residence. The first plans are documented by a group of full-size drawings for interior elements that Heaton's office produced between November 1909 and February of 1910. These and other early drawings seem to have been initially produced as upgrades to the original 1893 house, as the layout and decorative scheme for certain rooms differ from their later appearance in the enlarged mansion. Elements from these early designs were also employed in the later additions to the house. For the entrance hall, Heaton prepared drawings in 1909 to 1910 for a scrolled ornamental bracket with acanthus leaves that is located at the entrance to the main stairs. These and other drawings from the Heaton redesign are held at the Library of Congress. At left, we see another drawing prepared by Heaton during the 1909 to 1910 period for the entrance hall stairs. And at right is a photograph of the stairs that show these stair details. If you look in the photo, you can see the scrolled brackets that we looked at earlier in the previous slide. They can be seen supporting the crown molding at right. Heaton opened up a large hall-like space on the ground floor of the 1893 house, which was initially referred to as the living room in early drawings. It would later come to be known as the music room, and it featured an Aeolian pipe organ at its north end and a large stained glass oriole window at its south end. In 1912, Heaton developed drawings for the room's north elevation, shown at left. These details can still be seen today as shown in this pre-restoration photograph taken in 2020. And here is another view of the music room that was taken in 1986, looking south. Note the painted ceiling joists. The exterior details of the house were starting to take shape as well during this period. In September of 1912, the O.W. Ketchum Terracotta Works prepared a drawing for terracotta chimney caps and trim, which are still extant. The company was based in Crumlin, Pennsylvania, and it was one of the principal manufacturers of terracotta architectural ornamentation in the eastern United States during the early 20th century. By May of 1914, Heaton had produced elevation drawings and floor plans for the house, reflecting his proposed alterations. The title block of these final drawings featured the evocative name Ishpeming, which the Corbys chose for their newly remodeled estate. It means high ground in the Chippewa Indian language. The Corbys were possibly influenced in their naming of the house by the arts and crafts movement, which was prevalent within both British and American society during this period and featured an aesthetic undercurrent influenced by Native American culture and design. Construction took place during the summer of 1914. This photograph of the south elevation, published in the Evening Star newspaper in July of 1914, shows the completed dining room and bedroom addition at right. As you can see, the remainder of the south elevation still reflects the original 1893 design. Construction took place during the summer of 1914. This photograph of the south elevation, published in the Evening Star newspaper in July of 1914, in December of 1914, the Evening Star newspaper published photos of the redesigned house, which is what we're seeing here. And these photos were taken after all of the work had been completed. So we're looking at the finished product here. What we can see at left is a view of the north elevation and the porte cochere. And what we see at right is the south elevation and the garden with the completed pool visible in the foreground. By the end of 1914, Arthur Heaton had largely completed his renovation of the Corby residence and garden. He continued to produce designs for various aspects of the house and grounds, however, between 1915 and 1919. In April of 1915, William S. Corby enlarged the property through the purchase of Lot 2 in Block 26 from James J. Clark. The lot extended 125 feet along Connecticut Avenue and 135 feet along Irving Street. By June of 1915, Heaton had completed a preliminary drawing for the driveway layout and Connecticut Avenue entrance gate, which matches the existing. The drawing shows a proposed tennis court as well, located between the northeast corner of the house and the current garage. Final drawings for the gate were completed in November and December of 1915. In the photo at right, members of the Corby family can be seen standing near the gate circa 1920. And what we see here is a circa 1920s view of the north side of the property. And you can see the tennis court in the foreground at right. Arthur Heaton designed alterations to the lower level of the rear garden in June of 1921. The changes included a new design for the pool, reflecting its current larger footprint. The design includes a single set of steps at the north end, providing access from the terrace with a single set of steps descending to the pool from both the east and west sides, and two sets of steps at the south end. According to the drawings, the pool is of reinforced concrete construction and featured a fountain at its center. The coping is of cast aggregate concrete. The 1921 drawing shows the pool surrounded by a flagstone walk on all sides, which is still extant. The plantings, which included a screen of yew trees at the north end, flanking the steps leading from the terrace, and beds along the sides containing pachysandra and ivy, have been changed over time. Here are two undated photos, likely taken during the 1920s after Heaton's landscape design was implemented, showing the Corby children. At left is Eleanor and Justine Corby, and at right is a younger Eleanor. Heaton's office prepared preliminary concept elevations and a floor plan for the garage in June of 1924. The final drawings for the garage mostly reflect the existing building, although there have been some exterior alterations over the years, particularly to the interior, which has been rehabilitated into a living space. Following the death of William S. Corby in 1935, Muriel Corby continued to live at Ishpeming until her death in 1967. Mr. and Mrs. Corby collected fine art and antiques, and the house was filled with their treasures. For over 60 years, the house served as the social hub of Chevy Chase and was the scene of concerts, musicals, parties, and club meetings. An annual tradition was the family's afternoon Christmas Eve party. The Chevy Chase Garden Club was established at the house in 1926 and frequently met at the estate. Upon Mrs. Corby's death in 1967, New York's Sloan Galleries appraised many of the furnishings and artwork and held a large auction on October the 7th through 11th, 1969. And here we see Mrs. Corby seated in the music room. Since the death of Mrs. Corby in 1967, The house has been owned by 5 different owners. During the early 1970s, the Corby's daughters leased the house to Dr. and Mrs. Alan K. Doan, who opened the house to many civic and cultural events, including Sunday afternoon musicals and benefits for several Montgomery County organizations. In 1974, the American Security and Trust Company, acting as trustees of the Corby estate, sold the property to the Protestant Episcopal Cathedral Foundation of the District of Columbia. The foundation intended to operate a school on the property, but due to zoning restrictions, sold it in 1976 to Dr. and Mrs. John E. Threlfall of Bethesda. The Threlfalls lived at 9 Chevy Chase Circle until 1985, when they sold the property to a local real estate developer who, unable to sell the house, proposed to subdivide and redevelop the property. Individuals in the Chevy Chase community subsequently had the Corby Mansion designated in 1989 as an individual site in the Montgomery County Master Plan for Historic Preservation. The house was later owned by noted economist, businessman, and conservative political theorist Burton C. Gray and his wife Dorothy from 1989 to 1991, and by John and Janet Cafaro from 1991 to 2020. In March of 2020, the property was purchased by Adrian Arsht. Though the Cafaros owned the mansion for 20 years, they lived in Ohio and rarely visited the estate. It is understood that they used the house for infrequent political entertaining and never actually lived there. Over time, lack of use caused many aspects of the property to become run down, damaged by weather, and otherwise time-worn. Some neighbors have even commented that they didn't even know that there was a house behind the overgrown grounds. But Mrs. Arsht, who has extensive experience in restoring historic properties, recognized potential when she saw it. She has devoted 2 years to the restoration and preservation of this historic architectural treasure, which she has named the Folly. She assembled a team of architects, designers, builders, and other contractors to breathe new life into the deteriorating old mansion. In addition, she constructed a new outdoor pavilion that is architecturally compatible with the house and enhances the overall property. The rehabilitation project was directed by Barnes Vans Architects, with work completed by Bent Incorporated, Gibson Homes LLC, Cass Engineering, and Tanglewood Conservatories. The comprehensive rehabilitation included the removal of existing slate from the roof, repaired damage to the underlying surfaces, and replaced the roof using a combination of salvaged historic slate roof tiles and new slate tiles to match the existing. All historic windows were restored and repaired, and all non-historic windows were replaced with new painted window units that featured insulated glass, simulated divided lights, and leaded muntins to match the appearance of the existing originals. All non-original paint was removed from the exterior stone walls of the house, and non-original materials and elements were removed, and original finishes were restored. Pictured here is a before and after photo of the South Music Room gable, showing the repair and restoration of the existing wood trim and stucco. These photos were graciously provided by Gibson Homes. And here are before and after photos of the front entrance. In addition to the restoration of the exterior of the mansion, Mrs. Arsht commissioned her team to create a new outdoor pavilion for the south end of the property, which we see here. This structure replaced a worn, old wrought iron gazebo, which had no architectural merit and was highly inappropriate for the property. The new pavilion, on the other hand, complements the house, is up to the standards of the property, and enhances the overall estate. The new pavilion is modeled after the Chinese pavilion built in 1789 at Cassan in L'Isle-Adam, France. That pavilion is a rare survivor, one of a mere handful among hundreds of chinoiserie pavilions that once stood in the folly gardens of the Ancien Regime, France, before the French Revolution of 1789. The new pavilion constructed is located at the far end of an existing pool that is to become a lily pond. It is painted in colors that match the colors of the Chinese pavilion at Cassan. And like the Chinese pavilion, This pavilion extends over the water of the existing pool on a base that features 3 arches. It is elegant by itself, yet it also complements and fits in with the overall ambiance and design of the estate. For the first time in 2 decades, lights are again burning brightly throughout the house, illuminating the northeast point of Chevy Chase Circle and serving as a focal point of entry to Montgomery County from Washington, D.C. For her efforts and for this gift to the community, the Chevy Chase Historical Society nominated Ms. Arsht for a 2021 MPI Historic Preservation Award. And MPI responded, as we say in historic preservation, in kind.
So now, to conclude, just remembering that it's prominently located on Chevy Chase Circle, the Folly, formerly known as Ishpeming and Corby Mansion, is one of the leading examples of the Tudor Revival architecture style in the Washington region. Initially constructed in 1893 as the centerpiece of the planned suburban community of Chevy Chase, the house was first occupied by the Newlands family. And then in 1909, the Chevy Chase Land Company sold the property to William S. Corby, who had generated great wealth through his innovations in the commercial bread making industry. Between 1909 and 1914, Washington architect Arthur B. Heaton developed and finalized architectural and landscape plans that would transform the original 1893 design, a fine shingle-style country house, into a much larger, grander mansion that reflected Heaton's knowledge of late medieval English, Italian Baroque, and classical architecture. The Ishpeming era ended with the death of Mrs. Corby in 1969, and the house has changed hands several times since. There have been a number of interior and exterior alterations to the house in recent years, each time updating the house to ensure its contemporary relevance. But today, under the stewardship of its new owner, Adrian Arsht, 9 Chevy Chase Circle remains a significant local architectural landmark with history deeply connected to the early period of Chevy Chase's development, as well as individuals prominent within local and national history. And through her efforts, this building and its property will continue to be one of the most important sites in the Maryland and Washington, D.C. area. And with that, we'd like to thank you for listening to us, and we are certainly open to questions.
Thank you very much for your wonderful and informative presentation. We do have many questions that got sent in during the presentation, but we welcome you to continue sending in your questions. Just to start, there was a general question that I think might help out a lot of people, and it is, if what is now Chevy Chase Village is Section 2, what was Section 1 of Chevy Chase?
I think I can answer that. Section 1 of Chevy Chase is actually in DC. It's right over the border, sort of behind what is the Montgomery County Library that is on Connecticut Avenue. There's some very large houses back there, and that is Section 1.
Another question was that someone said the pool reminded them of the one at the Great Gatsby's fictional home, and that it is a similar time frame. Is there anything that you can say about what the prevalence of such a specific type of feature was, and its importance in that time period?
Well, John, you want to take that?
That's a very good question. I would say that water features have been something that have been associated with great houses throughout much of Western history. You see this dating back to Renaissance Europe and even earlier. You would say even going back to ancient Rome as well. And this tradition continued into the 20th century and was embraced by the arts and crafts movement. And it's a landscape feature that we see frequently in houses from this period.
Right. People like water features. There's no question of it. And so when it's possible to incorporate them into their design because they have the money or the desire to do so, then you'll see them often. So.
Another question is, did the plans include spaces for on-site workers? If so, how many people besides family members live there at various times?
I'm not familiar with where those spaces were located. It's been some time. I'm several years removed from in-depth research on this project, but I would assume that yes, that there were certainly living spaces in the house for servants. And I apologize, I just off the top of my head don't know exactly where in the house they were located. But I would think more than likely in the basement level or possibly in the attic level.
Mhm.
That's traditionally where you find that.
Right.
Do you know how many rooms are in the house or how many square feet is in the house?
Again, that's a tough kind of detailed question.
We can look that up.
Yeah, I will say that the number of rooms in the house has changed over time with varying kind of restoration renovation campaigns. But I would say on the ground floor, there are probably about 6 to 10 principal spaces that are very significant. And then on the upstairs, there are a number of more domestic residential spaces within the house. And those have seen some alterations over the years, but the really iconic spaces are on the downstairs
Yeah.
portion.
And I think we really didn't discuss the interior. That was for another time, but the fact is this is a very unusual floor plan. It does have an entrance, but it's not something that you'll typically see a center hall or a side hall or what, familiarity with houses that are in the Chevy Chase or other areas like this. This is a unique building for sure.
And there's a question about another unique feature of the home, which is the Aeolian organ. And someone would like to know if the organ was restored or not.
I don't know if we know the answer to that. I don't think so. We'll have to ask Mrs. Arsht if she's done that.
Another question is from someone who grew up on Quincy Street in Martin's Addition, and they would like to know if you can put into context the time of Martin's Addition being added to the building of Chevy Chase Circle.
Interestingly enough, while Newlands was building his land holdings to devise Section 2, what is now known as Section 3 was actually a separate subdivision that was subdivided prior to Chevy Chase Village being subdivided by just a few months, but it was definitely first. And that was the Reborn was the name of it. And if you will know history, Chevy Chase it's named after a battle in the Cheviot Hills, and the generals were Percy and Douglas, which were the two streets, and the location was Otterbourne. And so there's a direct relationship, but the owners were not Newlands. They were, however, Californians. And Newlands obviously must have gone around and, told everyone how wonderful things that were in the Washington, D.C., Maryland area, and that they should all invest all their money. And these Californians actually did buy what is now Thornapple Street and Underwood Street between between Connecticut and Brookville, though it didn't go all the way through. These two streets didn't go all the way through, but they were separate subdivisions. So that's Section 3. And there's Section 5 and the different ones. So the rest of them came a little bit later as development was more popular. There was a lot of slowdown in because of the recessions that would take place with real estate, like in the 1890s, there was some recession. And there was, some of you may know No Gain, which is the farm land that's on Brookville Road, but just to the would be just to the north of the the Brook Farms, which was now, of course, the restaurant that's there, La Ferme. But the property that was around there was owned by one big family, and they'd sold off the pieces for Otterbourne. They sold off that piece, and then they sold off other pieces. So I don't know the exact dates that they happened in, but obviously the success of Section 2 or Chevy Chase Village was so great. So many people came in. Newlands was such a good salesman that slowly, as development was possible, the area was developed. And so you start to see in the 20s and 30s, there's a lot of development, mostly in the 20s, late 20s, and the development takes place. So that's when there's a lot of subdivision taking place after those two initial ones being Section 2 and Section 3.
There's a question regarding Senator Newlands and his time at the House, and someone would like to know, where did the Newlands family live while the house was rented to Gage? And is it known why the original senator chose to build the house but not to live there?
I don't know. John, do you know that? The answer to that question?
Yeah, I think I do.
Okay.
I believe that Newlands, I believe that he had a lot of land speculation that he was involved with in the American West, particularly in the Reno, Nevada area. And I believe that he may have spent time in the West uh, at the time that he was renting the house during the summers to Secretary Gage.
Well, and I mean, we could certainly add is that Newlands, he was a senator from Nevada, but he actually lived in San Francisco. I think everybody should know that he lived in California. I mean, Nevada was a very desert area with, not a lot of prosperousness at the time. And he was developing, as John just said, Newlands was developing Nevada while he was developing the Maryland site as well. He was quite the entrepreneur.
And
Just
moving on, go ahead, I'm sorry.
No, say just the fact that he could live in California while he was a senator from Nevada tells you a lot about him, I think.
So with regards to the next owner, William Corby, somebody asked, do we have any idea why Corby wanted to undertake such an extensive renovation? Couldn't he have just bought a larger house?
That's a great question. Well, maybe he wanted to get that take the trolley down to his bakery down on 7th Street. That could be, because one of the pictures that John showed was of the original bakery building. And right now he then expanded. There are 3 buildings that are now owned by Howard University that are down there. And that was a big area of bakeries development along Georgia, which was then 7th Street and actually had a different name at that time. But I don't really know why he wanted to do that, but he came into a great deal of money. He and his 2, I think there were 3 brothers actually, were very successful in the bakery business. So maybe, such a prominent location, maybe why he was interested in doing it. And I think you all know that from a previous presentation that one of his brothers owned Strathmore, which is off of Rockville, where, now of course the county owns it and does incredible presentations of music and the arts there. Well, that is, so he owned that. And then, so maybe he just wanted to be closer in than his brother, who knows, but that was certainly in that track. So maybe he just wanted a bigger house than his brother, for all we know, could be.
Perhaps. Somebody else has asked, when was that back gate located on Brookville Road implemented into the property? And was this part of the original gate and grounds design during the first remodeling?
I believe that may have been part of the original Heaton landscape plan. If not, then it would have been something that was added later in the 1920s. He prepared a series of drawings over time during that period for different aspects of the property. So he would develop different elements, and it was kind of a long-term project.
And regarding your own personal experience working on the house, what was the most fascinating thing that you found during the restoration or during your research on the house?
Wow, I think really just for me personally as a lover of architecture, it's just such a magnificent example of arts and crafts inspired Tudor revival, turn of the century, late 19th century Tudor revival. And I was really just awestruck by the quality of the interior spaces, the quality of the design, Heaton's very close attention, academic approach to applying the different architectural traditions in a revivalist way throughout the mansion. There's Italian Renaissance, there's English Tudor, there's colonial, there's Adamesque, as we mentioned earlier. There's a lot of different influences evident on the interior, and then the exterior is just such a great example. Yeah. Probably, one of the top examples in the DC area of that style.
And I will add is I lived on Thornapple Street actually for 32 years. And I went past this house almost every day. And I did not know what was happening inside it. I'd been in the house in 1985 when it had been for sale, but I didn't know what was going on, if anybody was living there or not. So I loved the research that John came up with in terms of understanding what was going on in the house or not going on, is because the family that, was not actually living there, and you sort of wondered if they were. We didn't really see if they were or not, but we never could imagine that someone would buy a house like that and not live there. But that's, that was what they did. So that was great. It was great to actually learn some of the background of the more recent past for the house.
And a question that I have seen come up very frequently within the chat is, what is the intention with the house now? And is it going to remain a private home? And if it is there any access to the public to this home?
I think you're gonna have to ask the owner that, and maybe the people at Chevy Chase can, that the Historical Society can ask her exactly what she intends to do. But certainly, if I understand properly, you have your gala is going to be there. So that's, there's opportunities possibly in the future to see the inside of the house. But I believe she's going to, she's maintaining it, and that's really good.
All right, and it looks like we are coming up on time. There's still a few questions. Someone says, is there still work going on at the house? There's always a lot of cars around the grounds.
I don't think we don't know the answer to that question, except that usually construction takes a long time to get everything completed. So probably things are being finished up, especially in this time of the pandemic with the supply chain problems. I'm sure the owner is dealing with catching up with all these little things that didn't come through when they were supposed to over the last few years. So she was quite a brave person to take this on during this period of time, and we're very lucky that she did.
Okay, well, it looks like we have just about come up on time. It's just about 8:30, and I believe we do have some closing remarks from our Vice President, Carolyn Grice.
Thank you, Renata. And thanks once again to Ms. Ig and Mr. Gentry for their presentation and for sharing with us their intimate knowledge of the history of the house and its residents at 9 Chevy Chase Circle. On behalf of the Chevy Chase Historical Society, we really hope that everyone enjoyed tonight's illustrated talk, and we hope to see you at our next one. Good night.